our series is on resisting the hostile environment. And for me, thinking about this topic over the last 12 months and beyond, one of the most important resources has been Leah Cowan's book, Border Nation, which I'll introduce a little bit more in a moment. I think for anyone interested in this area, it's kind of vital, provocative, incisive work. And so when I sort of shyly wrote to Leah to see if she might be interested in speaking at our series, I was really pleased when she said yes. Most of you will have been to these seminars before. How it will be is Leah will speak for about half an hour, and then we're lucky to have our colleague Jaspal Singh coming in as respondent and asking a couple of questions. And then after that, it will go to the floor. So if you've got questions, do the usual, raise your hand, that kind of thing. So Leah Cowan is a writer, somebody who works directly in advocating and supporting migrants with no recourse to public funds at Project 17. So I kind of said I would introduce Border Nation later, but I'll just kind of do it now. Here it is. Border Nation came out of Pluto Press, I think a year or two ago, 18 months, yeah. So get it. Exciting news came out, I think this week or last week. Leah's got a book coming out in June with Verso called Why Should Feminists Trust the Police, which will be really exciting to read. I won't say much more there because you're not here to hear me just ramble on. So I'm going to hand over to Leah now, and then Jaspar's going to come in with questions in about probably 25 minutes, half an hour. So thanks very much all.
Thanks, Dan. And thanks everyone for joining. Really appreciate Open University inviting me to speak today. It's a real pleasure to share some of my work and my ideas with you. And I'm going to set myself a little timer just so I don't ramble on for too long. So as Dan said, my name is Leah. I'm a writer and a charity worker. For my day job, I work at Project 17, which is an advice centre for migrant families who have no recourse to public funds and are facing homelessness and destitution. And as Dan said, I wrote a book called Border Nation, A Story of Migration, which was published in 2021 by Pluto Press. And in that book, I was trying to join the dots between Britain's kind of marauding colonial past and the present day hostile environment that we're living in. And in doing this exercise of kind of joining the dots, I wanted to think through the ways in which Britain's colonial activities are not, in fact, confined to the past, but they have an active and very lively legacy that flies forward into the present day. So since that book came out in 2021, the border has continued to evolve. So present day bordering looks like attempts through the Nationality and Borders Act 2022 to create a two-tier system of asylum seeking. And that's whereby some people who come through these so-called safe and legal routes will have access to some rights and support, and people who arrive through so-called illegal, irregular routes would be deemed inadmissible and they would face removal. And that was very much found to be in contravention of human rights and international law. Ended up creating a lot of extra work for the Home Office, and that was paused in July last year. We've also seen the Illegal Migration Act 2023, which has this focus on stopping people arriving on small boats in particular from being able to claim asylum, and attempting to send people who are seeking asylum to Rwanda, this kind of Rwanda plan that we've heard a lot about, to have their claims processed there and to block them from returning to the UK. And these plans have also so far been thwarted by legal challenges. So just in the kind of 2 years since the book came out, we've had some pretty huge attempts at further bordering here. So in the talk today, I want to think through some of the connections between empire, race, borders, and criminalisation. And I'm going to be picking up on the role of what I'll call carceral feminist logics, and I'll explain that in a bit more detail, in bordering processes in particular. And we'll have a look at the racial capitalist basis for the border regime and its everyday expressions of violence. So first off, let's think through what is the hostile environment and what are these everyday borders? Well, the phrase hostile environment describes the driving agenda behind a web of laws and policies that particularly ramped up in 2012. And these laws and policies seek to make life in the UK practically impossible for large groups of people. The hostile environment intentionally blocks people from accessing vital services that the majority of us need to survive and to thrive. And this includes public healthcare, state education, housing and homelessness support, driving licenses, social care, welfare benefits, bank accounts, everything that you can think of, among others. And alongside these policies, which create this regime of everyday borders, the hostile environment approach inflicts more kind of policing, surveillance, state violence, including through things such as Prevent, which is an Islamophobic program, on our communities. We've also seen an increased use of raids on homes, businesses, workplaces, and the expansion of the immigration, detention, estate, and the deportation regime. The phrase hostile environment, though, was actually popularised back in the 1990s. Theresa May was just doing a kind of refresh on it in 2012. So it was notably uttered by the Labour Immigration Minister Liam Byrne, who sought to, in his words, quote, flush illegal migrants out through imposing fines for businesses who were employing undocumented workers. And Byrne also stated that, quote, we are trying to create a much more hostile environment in this country. So this rhetoric and approach would be kind of reheated, plated up and served again by the Conservative government a few decades later. And that's in 2012 when Theresa May, at the time Home Secretary, later Prime Minister, used kind of inflammatory and dehumanising language to state that, quote, the aim is to create here in Britain a really hostile environment for illegal immigrants. So the actual function of the hostile environment is quite kind of multifaceted. A primary driving force behind the hostile environment is that it fuels the scapegoating of migrant communities for issues that are in fact related to kind of abysmal governance and policy decisions, erroneous suggestions that everyday people accessing public services is the root cause of problems within those services, and that blocking access will improve the situation. And the logic of this idea and the consequent targeting of migrant communities is incorrect as a kind of starting point. Data shows that migrant communities are statistically less likely to access services such as the NHS and welfare benefits. And this point, while true, risks slipping into very dangerous notions that migrant communities only deserve to be here because they have a net benefit on the UK economy. And we need to fight to kind of uphold the fundamental principle that everybody should have a safe and comfortable life in the place they wish to live, regardless of what money they earn, what taxes they pay, or how much support they do or don't need from the welfare system. So through shouting about the need for a hostile environment, the government hopes to sweep under the rug its chronic underfunding of public services like the NHS and state schools, its failure to rebuild social housing stock after the sell-offs in the 1980s and the subsequent unavailability of quality housing, as well as over a decade of austerity economic policies, where we saw public funding, public spending being slashed to the bone in order to bail out bankers after the financial crash. Relatedly, profit-making companies provide a huge locomotive for the hostile environment. So while punitive welfare policies push lots of people into poverty, the expansion of the immigration detention and the prison estate, as well as the deportation regime, continues to funnel public money away from vital services and into the pockets of shareholders for these private companies who manage and maintain these aspects of the border. So I want to think a little bit now around bordering as a process of criminalisation. And processes of bordering increasingly criminalise everyday acts that are seen as breaches of the border. And this is part of the kind of laws and policies that fall under the hostile environment web of ideas. So, for example, there are now criminal offences for a range of activities, including renting a property to somebody who is undocumented and who doesn't have the right to rent under the 2014 Immigration Act. And it's also a criminal offence to work without permission, for example, because you're undocumented or because you're seeking asylum and you haven't been granted permission to work, or because your visa doesn't give you permission to work. It's also a criminal offence to employ someone who doesn't have the right to work, and it's a criminal offence to knowingly stay in the UK beyond the expiry date of your visa. So these are just a few examples. The overall lean here is towards criminalising basic acts that are essential for living, such as having somewhere to live, having shelter, and having money, being able to work and earn money to buy essential things. So border controls in the form of restrictions and conditions placed on people's visas, all that people are subjected to by default by virtue of not having any leave to remain, so being, excuse me, undocumented, also push people into breaking the law. So, for example, if somebody has no recourse to public funds as a condition on their visa, they can't access welfare benefits and they can't access social housing. And this no recourse to public funds condition is a cornerstone hostile environment policy. And since 2012, it's meant that most people who get limited leave to remain in the UK, which is a kind of pretty standard visa, it means that they have this no recourse to public funds condition attached to their leave. And this policy rode in on the back of quite wildly fabricated connections between migration and a lack of social housing, and attempts to scapegoat migrant communities for the crisis in public services. And this narrative was parroted by MPs and amplified by the national media and finds its way into policy and legislation. And no recourse to public funds, or NRPF as it's often referred to, acts as a sort of socio-economic stigma. It effectively means that if somebody falls on hard times, perhaps because they can't work due to being the sole carer for children, and they're a single parent, perhaps there's a pandemic and they lose their job, perhaps they're experiencing domestic violence and they have to flee their home and they have no income. A range of situations people might find themselves in, is very difficult to access any support. In addition, people who are undocumented can't access public funds by default, so they can't access any benefits. They also don't have permission to work without breaking the law. So there's really no legal way for that person to survive and to thrive in the UK. However, crucially, there is an inherent contradiction here in that the government is aware that people need to work to live and earn money to live. So criminalising work will not stop people working. In fact, the economy is actually quite reliant on the underground economy and unregulated work, whose workers are creating profit, but at the same time not accessing public services because they're blocked from doing so. Due to their vulnerability to exploitation and the lack of state support, these workers tend to work in sectors which have hard to fill vacancies and struggle to retain staff, perhaps due to the strenuous nature of the work, the poor working conditions and the low pay. And studies have shown that undocumented people in the UK mainly work in construction, agriculture, textiles, hotels and restaurants, cleaning, care work and domestic work. These are all sectors where pay is low, contracts are really unstable, employers are perhaps unwilling to pay for proper sponsorship to lawfully employ workers from other countries. And my point here isn't that undocumented workers are filling this labour gap and it's a kind of wonderful solution and a great thing for the economy, but more that the economy is reliant on undocumented workers, and the government doesn't truly want to stop this work from happening because it would have a negative impact on the economy, which is one of their primary concerns. But nonetheless, once someone is criminalised for simply trying to live, they're then dragged into the criminal legal system, which creates both the social narrative and the legal basis for that person being pushed out of the country. And that's where we see the kind of nexus of the criminal legal system and the border system coming together. And there's a great book by a collective called Cradle Community. The book's called Brick by Brick: How We Build a World Without Prisons. And in that book, the authors describe this interlocking web of borders and the legal system as crimmigration. So the combination of criminal law and immigration law, which is aimed at controlling the poor, disposing of undesirables, and maintaining the nation state's power. And that's a quote from the book. And there's a whole set of mechanisms that exist for deporting somebody also once they've become entangled in the criminal legal system. And this concept of a foreign national offender is something that really gathered steam in the late noughties, culminating in the creation of the 2007 Borders Act. And that gave the Home Office the automatic power to deport someone who was not a British citizen who had served a prison sentence of a year or more. And the bandying around of this term, foreign national offender, reached peak usage in 2016. And that was when politicians were conjuring these racist imageries of migrant men to encourage voters that Britain needed to leave the EU in order to protect itself from external threats. So who is in the viewfinder of the everyday borders? Who is particularly being targeted? I feel like we're starting to probably get quite a clear picture of that. But the hostile environment particularly targets undocumented people who don't have papers or leave to remain in the UK. However, the far-reaching tendrils of the laws and policies of the hostile environment target migrant communities quite broadly. So this includes people in a wide range of situations who are subject to the NRPF condition, as well as people who are racialized and profiled as non-citizens by state agents, irrespective of their actual citizenship status. And this designation of citizenship is a very precarious label for anyone who is subjugated within racial capitalism. And for British people who have ancestral linkages to other countries and islands, our Britishness is always hanging in the balance. It's reliant upon us towing the line and not posing an obstacle to the smooth running of racial capitalism. And the abolitionist Ruth Wilson Gilmore describes racism as the state-sanctioned and extra-legal production of vulnerability to premature death for particular groups of people. So racism, articulated in this very precise and clear way, I think, uncovers the ideological basis for the hostile environment, where the primary objective is to push as many people who don't fit the state's vision for itself, particular groups of people, as Wilson Gilmore says, into poverty and poor health. This is premature death, as she defines it. The intention here is to inflict seismic physical and psychic violence upon communities and to keep people in a state of economic precarity and fear of being pushed out of the country. And I want to move a bit now to thinking about the particular arguments and kind of logics that are used to prop up the hostile environment. And I'm thinking and writing a lot at the moment around this notion of carceral feminism. And I have a book coming out later in the summer, which looks at the history of carceral feminism in Britain in a bit more detail. But I'll explain a bit about what I mean by that. So increasingly, we've seen feminist arguments being used to support hostile environment policies, such as raids on brothels and nail bars being supported in the name of tackling, quote, modern slavery. We've also seen the use of deportation of both survivors and people who have harmed others, posed as a response to domestic violence. Feminists, some feminists also provide support for harsher prison sentences for domestic violence and rape cases, and this provides fuel to the expansion of the prison and the detention estates and attempts to create new laws and new criminal offences. And we need to really resist the leverage of these carceral feminist arguments in support of a hostile environment and a punitive system. And when I use the phrase carceral feminism, I'm talking about a particular flavour of feminism which sees the state, its agents, and its powers of surveillance, harassment, and brutalisation through the criminal legal system as necessary in the fight for women's safety, women's rights, and gender equality. So since the hyper-criminalising era of the 1990s, some feminists have steered new laws onto the statute books, and the potential to concretise further forms of harm into laws and to make existing laws more punitive and more harsh have provided an infinite task load for feminist organisers and lawyers and organisations. And the pursuit of criminalisation is really an endless labour. It has vast scope for draining time, energy, resource, and attention from social movements. Central to carceral feminism is the creation and vilification of myriad folk devils to buoy up this system of ideas. So the gangmaster, the nascent terrorist, and across and beyond both of these, the pathologically violent racialized man. And the invocation of these folk devils is followed by the demand from carceral feminists for the invention of more criminal offences in order to ensure some women's safety from this ominous cast of characters. And we can observe the slippage from revolutionary feminist thought into carceral and bordering logics. And I would point to three key concepts of carceral feminism that help us to really observe and understand this. So firstly, there's this idea of a fixed and powerless victimhood that's quite critical to carceral feminism. Secondly, there's this idea that the perimeters of womanhood are very much gate-kept. And lastly, we see the insistent divorcing of experiences of violence from their social and economic contexts. And these ideas are rooted in white supremacy and provide support and fuel to processes of bordering. The unreformable villain who perpetrates harm because they are inherently evil, the pimp, the punter, the gangmaster, these characters are imagined to be always somewhere out there. And so border control becomes a tactic of protection, with violence a potential contagion that must be held at bay. And academic Sarah Faris describes this particular expression of carceral feminism as femo-nationalism. So they write about the ways in which this clarion call for women's rights is invocated in order to further a racist nationalist agenda. And this is evidenced through the way that ideological convergences are formed between right-wing politicians and neoliberal white feminists who seem to have a kind of shared agenda. And the victim of these harms, to follow carceral logics, have to fit within boundaried categories of womanhood, where women are stripped of any agency and assumed to be unable to make decisions or to have strategies or resources for their own lives. And we see this in the response to modern slavery, which is very much a focus on border control, on removing workers from the country, on this idea that the Home Office knows what's best for these workers and these people, and what's best for them is to send them back to situations of economic instability and poverty. The social and economic context of informal border crossing, working without permission, and engaging in illegalized forms of work, such as sex work, is also very much overlooked in this logic. So there's an assumption that women are thrust into situations against their will, which does happen in a minority of cases, but without any consideration that people are making strategic choices within an extremely limited range of options. And these options are limited precisely because of a system of global inequality. Understanding the role of carceral white supremacist and imperial feminism in justifying and reproducing the hostile environment, I would argue, is absolutely critical. And we can see plainly how white feminist understandings of harm, risk, and safety provide fuel and fire to the border regime and the criminal legal system. So I want to talk a little bit now about the through line between empire and borders, and the creation of this system that I've referred to a few times of racial capitalism. So the hostile environment's most recent iteration was introduced in 2012, but this approach is part of a centuries-long trajectory which stretches back to Britain's key role in transatlantic slavery and colonialism. And the British state consistently hoards up wealth inside its borders for elite slices of society through extracting resources from other countries and labour from the international working class. So it periodically invites people to come to the UK. And we saw this with the Windrush generation in the late 1940s onwards, and with the expansion of the European Union in the early 2000s. But ultimately, Britain just wants people to bring their labour, and it doesn't want people to settle down and build a life here among their families and communities. The state doesn't want to support communities, undocumented or otherwise, or provide any of the basic things that people need to stay alive. This provides the backbone to the hostile environment approach. And the crucial context for colonialism and transatlantic slavery, the trajectories of which connect up with the hostile environment in the present day, is a context of racial capitalism. So the Marxist scholar Cedric Robinson coined this phrase, racial capitalism, and he uses this phrase to try and explain the way that capital, so wealth, as the scholar Jody Melamad has summarized, wealth can only grow by moving through dynamics of severe inequality between human groups. And this means that in order for elite minorities, such as bosses, to flourish under capitalism, huge chasms of economic difference must exist, enabling the exploitation of working class people for their labour. And racial capitalism is a global world order. The hostile environment takes its cue from racial capitalism by blocking access to vital services for people who face oppression along lines of race, class, and more. And so I'm going to finish up by thinking a little bit about what resistance looks like, because I've been talking about the kind of overwhelmingly bleak and quite depressing nature of this Leviathan, this system, this web of policies and laws. But I think it's important to really focus on the fact that this is very much being pushed back against. So the hostile environment can and is being challenged from every single direction. Because it is a policy approach, it cuts across a huge range of areas of life and lots of different communities and workplaces and locations, and lots of different individuals and groups are working really hard to chip away at it from every angle. One of the most fatal dimensions of the hostile environment is that it seeks to make life untenable by pushing people into poverty and poor health. And we can push back against that by supporting people in our communities and our workplaces to access services where possible and where desired. So that might be registering at a GP, accessing free school meals, accessing a whole range of services in our communities. And where people have no way of accessing those services, we can get involved in and set up mutual aid groups and collectives that can provide essential things outside of the state system. So whether that's food, clothing, safe accommodation, leisure activities, therapeutic support, places to gather and build community. These are all really crucial ways that we can help people to sustain themselves and each other when they're subjected to state and border violence. Another really great way to support people who are affected by the hostile environment in their workplace is to join a trade union in order to build community, share knowledge and ideas, and protect and assert our rights as workers. And this can be particularly useful in sectors where there are larger numbers of people who may be undocumented. So we can resist document checks, raids, and racism within our workplaces. And it's a really important aspect of pushing back against the hostile environment. Unions are a great place for building worker power and solidarity. And communities can also inform themselves on how to resist the ways in which the border regime shows up in the places where we work and spend time. So the Anti-Raids Network is an autonomous, non-centralized network of local anti-raids groups, which are made up of people who want to support people in their local areas, to know their rights around immigration raids and be better equipped to resist them. And there are also cop watch groups across London, organising locally, training people to intervene when they see the police in their neighbourhood. And Level Up is also a feminist community that runs workshops on how to support people during an immigration raid, how to intervene as a bystander when we see the police harassing people, and when we see people also facing harassment in general without having to call the police. And there's also lots of groups that work in solidarity with people in immigration, detention, and people who are facing deportation and removal. So you can follow groups such as SOAS Detainee Support and Stop Deportations on social media to find out ways to get involved and support campaigns against border violence, because the only way that we are going to kind of tear down the hostile environment is by doing it bit by bit, starting locally in our communities and taking all the actions that we can. Thank you so much for listening. I know that was a lot of talking. I really appreciate your attention, and I'm looking forward to hearing your questions as well.